Dr. Steiner was born in Prague, Czechoslovakia, and resided there until 1942, when the Germans offered him another place to reside. He was in various concentration camps. 45. Returned to Prague, and in 48 was forced to leave because of the communist uprising. He went from there to Australia, where he received a bachelor's from the University of Melbourne in 1952, and from there to this country, where a master's was presented at the University of Missouri in 1956, and back to Germany for a Ph.D. from the University of Freiburg, 1968. He's been a professor here at Sonoma State University since then. He's the author of several articles and publications, has 2 books to his credit, and many television and radio interviews and documentaries. Perhaps the one thing which is of major interest is his field of expertise, which is study of the SS. And after the war, he had the opportunity to return to Germany and interview many former SS members, and which perhaps is a unique opportunity to have somebody who had been a prisoner have an opportunity to come back and interview his captors, and has approximately 200 hours of taped interviews, trying to understand what type of person is capable of these acts in a given situation. He is currently director of the Holocaust Study Center here at Sonoma State. And without further ado, I will present Dr. Steiner.
Thank you very much for your very kind introduction, Professor Lonka, for the honorary professorship which I gave him. But he deserves it. I mean, he's one of the few people who really lives up to the title. What I like to do before we go into the film is explain to you some of the basic concepts and notions which might help you to better appreciate what you are going to see. Now, my reason for going back to the perpetrators and major movers of National Socialism was simply because I was not satisfied with just researching the manuscripts which I in the various places, libraries and archives and what have you. I had a very specific need to get in touch with those people who were to a very large extent responsible for what had happened. And so I decided to introduce myself to SS people, Hitler secretaries, and what have you, and that led me to better understand the surroundings, the environment in which Hitler functioned. Because these people knew him from first-hand experience, and that's precisely what I'm interested in, to do primary research rather than secondary and tertiary, which depends on some conclusion, some information which has been given to the readers, to the researchers by other people, and not the person who is actually doing the research, and should therefore, if possible, be familiar with those people who are originators of what we are researching. So that is one reason why I've developed some degree of understanding of Adolf Hitler, and was asked to go to Stanford, submit to a very lengthy interview, which you won't see in the film at all, but is supposed to be another film based on some of the excursions which we have gone on. And so I was interviewed, and that led to that particular movie where they asked me to be one of the 2 consultants for that particular movie on Hitler. So what I'd like to relate to a little bit is two things. First of all, the way we went about to produce the film, and then secondly also what sort of concepts might be helpful to appreciate how Hitler functioned and what moved him to do the things he did, and what moved those who supported him and carried out his orders. So first of all, who was Hitler? Hitler was primarily a person of many faces. And the interesting part, which I thought I'll share with you, is that he was primarily an ideologue, a person who thought in absolutist ideological terms, which there was just one way, namely his way. And that was the way, the view of his world, that's the way he viewed the world. So, when you just think in terms of some of the ideological concepts which he introduced, which includes, for example, the of Heil Hitler, which replaced all the other traditional greetings, you'll find how absurd all this has been, and yet people, for very interesting reasons, accepted these absurdities. And if we just, for example, raise the hand, we can say, well, that's how high my dog is jumping. But they didn't do that. They raised the hand and said, Heil Hitler. And just if you just stop for a moment and think, what will move you to do such a thing, you will see, well, it's very difficult for anyone to move me to do such a thing, which is absurd. And yet, 70 million people did it for reasons which escaped them. It was an appeal to emotions, which primarily did it for them. So, the fertile soil which made the individuals do what they did was provided primarily by the post-war environment, where politically and economically provided a situation which we call fertile soil. We can also call it a lock and key relationship which triggers events. So the lock can be viewed as the Versailles Treaty, which produced economic backups in Germany, and politically, of course, democracy was imposed on Germany. It was not their choice, but it was imposed on them by the victors. So therefore, that didn't function too well for sure, because that was not a country which had been democratized. So Hitler himself functioned as a key to trigger events, which also, among other things, not only led to World War II, but also brought about the Holocaust. Many years ago, a sociologist called W.I. Thomas stated, if men find situations as real, they are real in their consequences. Some of the most grotesque ideological absurdities became social, political realities because, as we said earlier, groups of persons had acted upon them. They reified them. They made them, by acting according to the proscriptions, they made them a reality. Now, the responsibility, of course, the initiator of the whole thing was Adolf Hitler. And he was accepted as some sort of a prophet. He, as a Führer, gave orders which were not doubted by those who followed these orders, carried them out. So there's one thing which is important in our particular relationship to what we're going to see in terms of the events which transpired. In a speech to the generals on January 26, 1944, Heinrich Himmler, who was in charge of the SS, who was the Reichsführer SS, told the generals, when the Führer gave me the order to carry out the entire final solution of the Jewish, I initially had my doubts if I could impose the execution of such weighty measures to my SS. But it was an order by the Führer, and what they called it was a Führer order, so all doubts had to be set aside, and we had to carry out the orders. This tells us, among other things, that first of all, and we have that from various lists, that the order given to Himmler and other SS personnel and those who dealt with the situation, particularly during the one-day conference on January 20th, 1942, that these orders were given verbally by Hitler and not in writing. And one of the most interesting comments on Hitler I received from Hitler's secretary Christa Schroeder. And when I discussed that with her and said, well, Hitler told me on several occasions that whenever something is highly controversial and should not be clear-cut, particularly in terms of historical consequences, I never give these things in writing but verbally, so that there is no documentation about them. That to me was very important, as well as so many other things, anecdotes which she told me, and she was a person who was with Hitler, Hitler's closest secretary since 1933, that is 32, before he actually came into power, and was with him virtually 24 hours a day, along with two other secretaries. But she was one of the senior, she was the second senior in Hitler's staff as personal secretary. Another thing which might give you a little bit of a feeling for what you're going to see is when she told me a interesting situation in which she found herself during one of the nights when there was an air raid on the headquarters, Hitler's headquarters, when all the light off and it was total darkness because of some sort of electricity failure. She was looking for a flashlight, which she had apparently misplaced, and asked one of the co-workers if he saw that particular flashlight, and Hitler happened to be present at that particular time. So she, so he responded to that, oh, you're looking for your flashlight. Well, I'm not the one, and he said that in a dialect, in an Austrian dialect, I'm not the one who stole your flashlight. I only steal countries and not flashlights. Flashlights, those who steal flashlights are caught, and the big thieves are left to run away free. And that was a very interesting thing, because it was an admission that he in fact was stealing countries out of his own mouth. Now there are very many other anecdotes, and what I'd like to do is, after the film, we will have a question and answer period, which where I hope we'll be able to answer questions which you may have. Another thing which I consider to be important for you to understand before you see the film is the insight which we gained through the simulated prison experiment which was conducted by Professor Philip Zimbardo of Stanford. And he concluded that the mere act of assigning labels to people and putting them into a situation where those labels acquire validity and meaning is sufficient to elicit pathological behavior. Now, in this particular simulated situation, similar things happened as they actually happened in reality in Germany, where you have dictatorships. And so we all are in a way vulnerable. We all are not immune to manipulation and persuasion, particularly when we have not learned to think straight and in logical terms, and when we are susceptible to absolutist ideologies which have very simple answers to complex problems. And these answers evasive and appeal to the masses, and then the chances are that masses will support them. Now, there was not one Hitler, but several Hitlers in one person. He was a mixture of lies and truth, simplicity and violence, modesty and luxury, charm and brutality, mysticism and realism, a connoisseur of arts and yet a barbarian. He was a person of extremes and contradictions, and it's very difficult to pinpoint specific characteristics, although it has been attempted and done on many occasions because we have many biographies. Those biographies which I prefer are written by those who actually have known him personally, have been in his entourage. And that is one of the reasons why I felt fairly comfortable to embark upon this sort of adventure to do the movie, the documentary, with the people who asked me to be their consultant, because it enabled me to go back to those people who knew and were available and to be interviewed, and also enabled us to go to the various places which were very important to Hitler, so that we could relate that to the audience and somehow produce for them a picture in which they perhaps could more easily relate to what actually had happened. We also consulted very many experts as to their views on Hitler, their analysis of Hitler person as a man, and that was also exceedingly useful. Then, of course, we also interviewed the victims and perpetrators, and most of these people I knew personally because I had interviewed them before, so it was not too difficult to get them to be interviewed for our purposes. Some people whom I didn't know were approached by my fellow consultant, whose name is David Irving, and he was, and he is, a person who denies the existence of the gas chambers, and he's what we call a revisionist. And he was also asked to participate in this simply because we wanted to have not only a balance in portraying Hitler, but also he knew people who would not let themselves be interviewed. Sing to them and ask them to be interviewed, and that was in itself, I think, a very interesting experience. And I said it was an adventure because at times they're very difficult about it, and some of them had to be offered a great deal of alcohol in order to cooperate. And I could tell you very interesting stories about specific events. But we were able to get many of these people who otherwise would have been very reluctant to submit to interviews. So I think it's just about time for us to see the film, and we will continue a question and answer period after you've seen the film.
Going to work. If this is not loud enough for the people in the back, let me know by raising your hand, okay? And I'll turn it up a little bit. I know it's going to be very loud for the people in the front. Where's the cover shot? Watch out for the wire.
I'll let let you just relax a little bit so that you can come to and start thinking about some questions.
Is the mic on?
Mic is on, yeah. Yes.
If, according to this film, the Allies knew that the slaughter was taking place in the camps, and it was reported in the churches and newspapers, why was there no response? And what is your
Response?
by the Allies to mitigate that?
Well, in my account, I'm describing that there were air raids, particularly in places which were slave labor camps and which produced war material. Just for example, in the case where I worked, the slave labor was syn fuel, synthetic fuel. And the air raids took place absolutely whenever thing waiting against the plant producing that synthetic gasoline was operating, they came and bombed it. Now, they did not go and do anything about those camps which simply housed people, which were concentration camps. But what they did is just simply ignore them, because what could they couldn't have done very much. They couldn't have liberated them, they couldn't have sent some parachutes there. And if they had bombed it, they would have killed the inmates. So it was not an easy thing to resolve, and I have no answer to that particular question other than what I'm telling you. I've seen these things also in Auschwitz you know, when they were just, for example, there were air raids on Auschwitz, and we were very happy about it. But the air raids on Auschwitz only took place because that was a war plant which produced essential war material.
I have a second question. The second question is, they were bombing the synthetic fuel factories. How close to where the crematorium and gas chambers were? How close?
No, that was Buna. What you're talking, Auschwitz was producing Buna. That is to say, synthetic
What was the
rubber.
distance between the place they were bombing and where the gas chambers and crematoriums were?
No, they were quite. There was quite a distance. Quite a distance. But they knew, for example, that in these slave labor camps, most of the people who worked there were, or a large percentage of them, were inmates. But they still bombed them, and we as inmates were not permitted to go into any air raid chapters, simply because we were inmates. That was only reserved to the so-called free workers, who were brought from all parts of occupied Europe, the Germans. And non-Germans were not permitted to go into the air shelters, so we had to hide in cellars and so forth, and very many people got killed that way because cellars were not sufficient to protect people from the bombs. Yeah.
Dr. Steiner, I hope this is not the subject, but yesterday in Washington, D.C., a survivor of the Holocaust awarded George Bush a humanitarian award. Do you have any comment on that?
Well, it's his problem. It's his problem, and we all are individuals and have to make our own decisions. I would have not liked to be in his place, to be perfectly frank with you. But merely because you are a survivor doesn't mean that you can think straight. You know, that's no guarantee.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying George Bush is...
I'm saying it. You're not saying it. I'm saying it. I assume the responsibility for it. Yeah.
I don't think he deserves a human award in any way, shape, or form.
Well, I tend to agree with you, but I'm quite sure that very many people here in the United States would be of different opinion. Yeah.
Regarding the charge as to the degree to which the Allies should have known about what was going on or not, it's important to point out that while there were rumors and stories that were filtering out of the East, none of them were thought to be credible. And one has to also realize that during wartime, rumors are as prevalent as bullets. One has to be very circumspect as to what one believes and then pursues in accordance with a policy of bombing or something. And that was just, the fact is that there was no hard evidence either from reconnaissance, aerial reconnaissance from the Allies, or from any reports on the ground that would lead them to believe that such a mass extermination program was going on. So hence they didn't react to it.
Well, I disagree with that, because first of all, the photographs which existed, and the people who escaped from destruction camps and told their stories. Not only that, but also SS, one particular SS leader who worked there and was witness to the gassing of plantations, leaked the information to the...
Are you referring to Kurt Gerstein?
That's right, Kurt Gerstein is one of them, yeah.
That's very interesting. You should quote the entire testimony, because if one does quote it in full, it becomes rather fantastical in its proportions.
Well, to you maybe, but not to me and some other people who have read this story.
Will you agree with one claim that Gerstein makes, that he personally had had knowledge of 25 million people dying?
No.
His testimony as well, though often not quoted in full.
Well, that's not something which I've read, and I have the entire account of Kurt Gerstein. And also he questioned, all right, so let's say 25 millions. It's bad enough if 1, 2, or 10. I mean, you know, or 5 million, or 6 million.
I would agree, but
all right, so I mean,
it adds to the shadow of doubt. Is my point. Why Allied authorities didn't deem these reports to be credible, because such a fantastic number would have, to the unlearned
Well,
Why
or
don't
the
you read some of the
uninitiated.
State Department reports at that time? You'll find some interesting data about
Okay.
food threats.
yeah.
I was wondering if the gentleman could explain what happened to my family, age 13 to 90, if they did not get executed.
I don't think he can do it because he was not alive at that particular time.
Dr. Steiner? I would like to make a
Yes,
comment
please do.
on that.
Yes.
The last session that we had last year, we had a gentleman here who made a study of all the church bulletins that were coming out Germany, and the churches here, they got the information all the time. This was not somebody who was interested to prove the innocence, but who was quoting facts. And this was all on black on white from the churches
But
in Germany.
no, he says that was all hearsay.
Yeah.
On that subject, did David Irving change his mind after working on this?
No, well, you see, the thing is they kept us separate for very specific reasons. So he was working at that time and I working another one. So we was simply working parallel from each other, but not together. Simply because they knew that there would have been a very unpleasant confrontation between him and me. And so they tried to avoid that. Actually, they only told me that very late in the process of doing the documentary, simply in order to avoid any unpleasantness. But I wouldn't have, I would have been very disgusting with him, but that was not the, yeah, Phil.
Does Irving actually deny the existence of the extermination camps in the film?
No, he denies one thing specifically, namely the gassing, and for example, there are some other revisionists who say that gassing never occurred, that there are no traces and all that, and I have a book here which has been published in Poland, where exactly the chemical analysis was made in 1945 after the liberation of Auschwitz, where we actually affects to that point that there were chemical analysis made, the fact that cyanide was used on the victims. So that is also a moot point, yeah. And this is a book I refer to and has not been published by a Jew or quote unquote or someone else. And there we have exact documents of the forensic analysis of hair and metal and whatever was found there. Right.
Seems ridiculous to me that they would even say that they didn't know what was going on, since supposedly the Allies knew about it. I mean, if we knew about it, it was halfway around the world from us. How could he not know about it when it's going on in his own country?
Well, of course. I mean, there are very many sources which point to the fact that very accurate information was obtained by the Allies. And, I could show on that, but I mean, I don't want to dwell on that particular subject too long because there may be some other perspectives which need to be discussed.
In the early stages, there was the thugism of the brown shirts, and it was paralleled or cited in the movie as being paralleled by the skinheads in the United States. What solution, what suggestion, what corrective action would be implied as far as you would be concerned?
Well, first of all, information and showing of facts and doing things which we are doing here, having events of that nature as we have here, and that's why one of the many reasons why we do what we do here, and hope that it will sink in and that we open that to public discussion and people will reflect on it and think about it and will be impressed so that they will be motivated enough to do something about it, become activists in preventing any future similar occurrences of that nature. So that's one thing. And then, of course, just the other day, I had a 12-year-old boy call me and said he would like to have an interview with me. And so I said, of course, and he came here and we've had an interview which was, actually he he taped it and was exceedingly mature for his age. As a matter of fact, too mature, I would say, for and so where did he get it from? I mean, he didn't. Apparently he had read something. His parents didn't motivate him to do anything of that nature. And as a matter of fact, he's going to get a prize. He's winning now. It's the what's called the history day of, not day of remembrance, but the history day of something, and they have some various schools here in California compete with each other who is going to present the best history in a fashion which is impressive. And right now he's winning, actually. He's now competing on a county level. So these sort of things we can do, and also most of these people here who are students, young students, will be parents one of these days. And I think that is a very important thing because they've been exposed to something which I consider to be exceedingly important and stimulating in terms of from the consequences of what some of the people, some of us who are survivors, some of the other people who have done research and published and all that, we have to we can present here during the lecture series, and I think that will make a difference. And we are gaining in momentum. More people hear about it, and the classes which we have, the lecture series, is growing in numbers. So that's what we are doing, and you can do your rest too. I mean, we can talk to politicians, and we can see to it that we will be in limelight of sorts. So that people will notice what we are doing and think about it. And for example, just to give you an example, I worked with Hitler's secretary on her memoirs, and that has appeared in Germany. It's by Christa Schroeder. I've mentioned her name before. She was my boss, the German title. And I'm trying to have that translated and have it published here, if possible. So, I mean, there's a lot of interesting literature, and there's no question about it. She was a party member, and she was an ideologue, and she had no children, or was not even married. Hitler prevented that because she was engaged to a Yugoslav, and that was not possible for Hitler to permit that, so he prevented it. And so she stayed an old spinster. Well, at that time she was not that old, but now she died as an old spinster. So there are a lot of interesting and very important accounts which are very insightful and show the Third Reich in different perspectives. And for example, I'm continuously in trying to work on similar things like that. I feel presentations of that nature, documentaries are a very powerful tool to make people think. Not to necessarily persuade, but just let them think and let them reach their own conclusions. Yes?
Will this film be shown commercially?
It has been in '89. And they showed it in San Francisco, Channel 7. It was on commercial television. And it's supposed to be a series. I don't know, they haven't called me. They said they would call me if continue the series. And because we've made a lot of, there's a tremendous wealth of material which has been produced while I was there. And so much of what I consider to be more interesting than what you've seen for some reason or another has not been included in the documentary. And I feel, for example, too much of Eva Braun. I think Eva Braun's role in the whole situation was exceedingly limited, and I think they included some much more important material, which we shot then in Austria or Germany, or interviews, what have you. But, it's a commercial enterprise. By the way, in spite of all the shortcomings, the documentary received 2 Emmy Awards, which is, quite something. Yeah.
I'm troubled by the tenor of the debate. What is your name, David? When David speaks, something inside of me that says, gee, I wonder if this is all true. My hold on reality gets very tenuous, and I'm not quite sure why that is. Is it because of all the television I've watched, that history somehow is not really relevant anymore? When I look at this film, there's a kind of a confusion in the film between entertainment and historical reality. So there is something. I do respond to you when you make these comments, and so it makes me think that our hold on history is very, very tenuous. Very tenuous. I mean, I'm now dope. And so when when the doubt begins to creep into my mind a little bit, I'm not quite sure what that phenomenon is. How can that happen?
Well, are you making a statement, or are you posing a question? Or just talking about your feelings?
It's a question. Maybe there's nobody else that has any of that in their minds.
So there is a thesis, and there is an antithesis, and there is a synthesis, right? And we are talking about historical thesis. And we have some people here and elsewhere maybe who will find an antithesis. And that is something, is nature of logical thinking. So my job was, and still is to a way, to get as much as information in order to really reach conclusions which will be and are properly documented, and I've done that in my publications as well as I possibly could. And I continuously get new material, additional material from very unexpected sources. Some people who are my best research assistants, if you will, are former members of the SS, and they continuously give me documents and send them to me from Germany and elsewhere. And I appreciate that, because it's a kind of a gesture which I would consider to be as a bit of restitution. I'm just qualifying that. And so apart from the fact, I return to archives and dig around and look at things which have not been looked at before, and which have been just brought into the archives. Also now from East Germany, a lot of additional material will come into archives in Koblenz in West Germany, which will be made available to the public. So if we really have a need to know, we can find means and ways to utilize the resources which are available to us. Yeah.
Even though there's nothing written that Hitler had given these particular orders, even though it's understood that he had given them, somebody else must have given written orders, either Himmler or any of the other parties in power, which should have given written orders for various kinds of events to take place. I wonder. They didn't stress that they didn't mention that in the film. In the film, they just mentioned that Hitler everything was based on euphemism and final solution.
No, I mean, he didn't, that's what publicly was used, final solution, all the euphemisms which we've mentioned before here. And I've talked at length. You know, I knew his secretary for very many years, and I was introduced to her by my mentor, a professor of mine, whom we call a doctor father, who just under whose vision I wrote my dissertation. And so I talked to her about many of the things. She gave me also original documents, what have you, which I copied. And but she was very adamant about the fact that there were no written orders given, and that Hitler had a very specific policy why he would not give written orders when very controversial issues were to be implemented, to be executed. And he was very clear. And I also received the same sort of answer from very many other very high Nazi functionaries.
Wouldn't Himmler have given written orders to some of his underlings to carry out certain...
Well, he talked to them. He also talked to them, but there are written orders, for example, statistics, and I've found very many important documents, statistical documents, which were sent to the Reichschancellery, and also were shown to Hitler in terms of how many Jews were killed and all this and that. And these do exist, and there was an SS statistician, a man called Dr. Koher, and he was applying that, and as a matter of fact, he was also rebuked by the party chancellery as well as by Himmler, because he did not use any euphemisms and did not use them enough, and so he was cautioned that next time he writes that he should rewrite that, and there are only very few copies made. So Hitler's notion was also you only to know as much to know for your particular job, and that was his very strict order. As a matter of fact, I have the copy of a original order which he gave to that extent, and these are very clear-cut policies. However, in speeches, and I've quoted one speech just earlier when I tried to give you a very short introduction, because time was not enough to do a proper job. But that was also very clear that these sort of orders were usually verbal, and Hitler also talked to the generals and to the Gruppenführers, the SS generals, about very specific situations. And one of my interviewees, who was also a SS general, after one of these lectures by Himmler, who made it very clear what was happening, very specific, very clear-cut, no euphemism, went to him and said, you know, this is morally irresponsible what you're doing, and he just simply brushed him off because he was too important a military man to do very much against him, otherwise he would have disappeared in a quick hurry.
John, there's also the record of the Wannsee Conference, which
is
very clear.
The Wannsee Conference is very, and there is a record which is very clear. I mean, the 20th of January 1942. We have a very interesting movie which was produced just recently, not a documentary obviously, but which is, I think, very well, portraying very well the Wannsee Conference. We have that as anyone who wants to see it, we can make a special sort of showing for those.
I believe somewhere in the film they are supposedly quoting Hitler as being appalled about the Kristallnacht. It would seem to me the only reason he would be appalled is that not enough was destroyed, not enough people were killed, and that maybe somebody jumped the gun before they wanted this kind of action to take place.
Well, I talked to people who were with Hitler at that particular day, and it was their opinion, their view, that he didn't know anything about it. Simply because he delegated all to Goebbels, and Goebbels was, and they agree on that Goebbels was exactly the person who initiated the whole thing. Goebbels, Joseph Goebbels, and you see him in the documentary,
Judgment, had Hitler not survived his service in the First World War, or had died as his brothers or sisters had, would there have been would those events that took place in Germany taken place anyway?
Well, you see, you've got the functionalists and you've got the
Well, it's a very interesting question.
I mean, let's bring you in a little bit. The functionalists and the got the two perspectives on whether or not Hitler triggered it. Intentionalist, you see. So I have no question about the fact that if Hitler had not come into power, these sort of things would have not happened. And where do I get the idea from? I have here Mein Kampf. And I also used it in my book, by the way. As a matter of fact, one of the few people who actually looked at it and read Mein Kampf. And on page 679, he says, if at the beginning of the war and during the war, 12 or 15,000 of these Hebrew corruptors of the people had been held under poison gas, as happened to hundreds of thousands of our very best German workers in the field, the sacrifice of millions at the front would not have been in vain. I don't know whether it's a coincidental, if it is a situational accident that people were gassed with this sort of thing. Hitler had in mind already in 1925, and maybe before.
So my question is, was Germany that type of a place, and at that time, taking into account the Depression and so forth? Let's say there was no Hitler. Would there another Hitler have come along with a different?
Well, for sure, another dictator. I think we can say with some degree of, I mean, how can you speculate about something which hasn't happened? And I think we have to be very careful about that. But in my opinion, and that's my opinion, another dictator would have assumed power, but I don't think that he would have gassed the Jews. I don't think he would have exterminated Jews. That is my personal opinion. But obviously, I mean, how can you document that? But that's, in terms of looking at all what we know or what I know, I just simply can't reach the conclusion that someone else would have behaved the way Hitler did, under the circumstances.
Could I just add something to
Yes, please do. Yeah, by all means.
I mean, that question is a very important one. Would there have been a Holocaust without Hitler? It's a very difficult question because from 1933 to the outbreak of the World War in 1939, the essential policy in Germany was to make life so unpleasant for German Jews that they would leave Germany. It's not until after the outbreak of the war that events had moved toward the final solution. And so you can argue that from 1933 to 1939, there was clear evidence that the policy was to force Jews out of Germany. Well, after 1939, Hitler was in the situation where Germany had conquered most of Europe and in fact had most European Jews under his control. And then Germany was in a situation historically where they could move forward towards the execution of as many Jews lay their hands on. And then very shortly after the beginning of the war, shortly by 1942, at the Wannsee Conference, a decision had been made to systematically round up all the Jews that they could lay their hands on. So the outbreak of the war and German successes played an enormous role in the development of the idea of the final solution. Something else which is very important, I might disagree a little with John on the significance of that statement from Mein Kampf in the 1920s about the gassing of a certain number of Jews. I say that you have to make a big jump to go from there all the way over to 1942, the Wannsee Conference, because there was a clear indication that Hitler's initial policy was to force the Jews out of Germany. I mean, that saved their life. About half the Jews left Germany before 1939, before the war broke out. After that, there was a German Nazi edict. Nobody could leave after World War II began. Nobody could leave Germany. Another very important factor is the idea of Hitler's infallibility. Hitler was a man of action. He did an extraordinary number of things in Germany. I mean, we're used to presidents who get elected and don't do very much. It's amazing what Hitler did from 1933 to 1939. He did an enormous number of things and won a tremendous number of diplomatic victories that no German could have conceived of being won. So that by 1939, Hitler had already more or less become for the Germans a kind of miraculous leader. And then from 1939 to 1941, when he won all these tremendous victories in Europe, nobody could say, it seems to me, nobody could say no to him. He was infallible. His diplomacy, his military victories had made him untouchable. What he wanted, the Germans were all too, or the Nazi hierarchy was all too willing to carry out. So that's a long answer, but it's a very complex, I personally don't believe that there would have been the Holocaust without Hitler. But you can't detach Hitler from the German defeat in 1918, from the Depression, from all of his victories, from a whole historic text in which Hitler developed. I think he had the power by 1941 to turn his private obsessions into public policy.
Well, I think that is something which needs to be more discussed, and yes, we have disagreements. Also, we mustn't forget there was a police state and tremendous resistance against Hitler, and that was suppressed. Concentration camps were full, so why concentration camps if there is no? So yes, there was an opposition, and certainly it made quite a bit of a difference, the fact that he was very successful in his enterprise. In particularly war enterprise, Poland and France and what have you, Belgium, Holland. So those people who were doubting Thomas's, of course, became a little bit more insecure, but then the tide changed. And then it was too late, because anyone who would came to a bad end, came to a very bad end. So that is something which we shouldn't forget. It was not a democracy. It was a police state. It was an autocratic state in which people could not dissent with impunity, and that is where we disagree.
You saw a snapshot about the resistance with the plot, July 1944 plot. Just remember, this started in 1937. It was going on for 7 years with Colonel General Ludwig von Sack, when he resigned from being chief of staff. He did say no to Hitler, and he lived 7 years. And there was they said 6 attempts. There were a lot more than 6 attempts on Hitler's life. Unfortunately, they didn't work.
Yeah, he was very lucky, and also he had supposedly a sixth sense, and that was just actually felt he was he had some sort of a unusual senses which helped him to escape dangerous situations.
The woman in the pink has had her arm up for an hour.
Yeah, right. Yes. Sorry.
We've got to leave here with the same question of why all of this is focused on the Jewish culture and the Jewish people. We hear all these terrible things happening have happened to these people, and I understand that there was a war, and then there was a depression, and so on and so forth. Why were the Jewish people singled out and put this on them? And of course it was the Slavs were killed and the Gypsies were killed too. But they didn't get obliterated. Their culture was not obliterated the way the Third Reich tried to take away. Why is it? What is it in people's minds then, and maybe now with the skinhead people? We aren't going through a depression right now. The skinhead people aren't going through a depression. They're not coming out of a war. But this feeling is rising up again. It's really frightening, and I do not understand why this can all be focused on a culture that is so rich as the Jewish culture. I am not a Jewish person. I just do not understand what it is, and each week it doesn't quite get to telling it. The messages don't quite get to telling us why it is that the Jewish people were singled out.
Well, the Jewish people out simply because there was a history of anti-Semitism. And they were the minority which was most frequently the target and who were chosen as scapegoats most frequently. Rather than
throughout history, why is it always the Jewish people who are singled out?
Why? Obviously because they're accused to begin with that they crucified the Redeemer, Jesus Christ. And that is the major reason why they've been targeted. as people who did not accept Christ as their Redeemer and called for his crucifixion. I mean, that is one of the basic things which every person almost knows. I mean, we all know that goes back to these times. I'm sure you must have heard of that.
Not to this degree, no. I don't think
You disagree? Well, you disagree with history. I'm sorry.
Not to this degree. I say not to this degree did I understand.
Oh, yes. Well, but I mean, that needs to be made very clear, and I'm glad you asked that, because I think we should note that as one of the basic reasons. The basic reason, as a matter of fact.
Another problem that helped in the creation or the continuation of anti-Semitism was that in the old days of Middle Europe, the Jews were really one of the few educated groups. But since the Jews could not own land, they became merchants. But also, they became the agents
Moneylenders
of the landowners.
Yeah.
And one of their functions was to come around and collect taxes. And nobody loves a tax collector.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, because they were limited in their choice of occupations, and most people don't know that. They were not permitted to toil in their own land and enter certain occupations, and most of these occupations they were permitted to enter were limited to business type of occupations. Yeah.
I think that is a failing in this lecture series, is that there has been a failure to really flesh out anti-Semitism. It's left in a haze and a fog, and there's been just two notable allusions even to its origin. One with the bringing up of the blood libel, and the biblical version of the allegation that the Jews had killed Christ. But both of those, I think, fail to miss the crux of modern anti-Semitism, which, I mean, I don't know why won't you, I mean, it's begun now a little bit with the speaking of the Jews being associated with money lending and the merchant profession and so forth. I think that is more necessary to understanding Nazism. The Nazis were not devout Christians at all. So their anti-Semitism must have been drawn from a different source.
Well, it was drawn from a number of different sources. And also what you've heard here, actually in the documentary, was made very clear that there was an overrepresentation, according to these people, in very pivotal positions, influential positions, because of their numbers. So there was an overrepresentation in terms of their actual number living in.
What happens establishes a scapegoat. It's like what happens in a bunch of hens. If one hen gets attacked by another hen and shows a spot of blood on it, then the other hens keep pecking on this same hen till she is dead. I mean, it's something sick, but it happens.
Yeah.
In fact, you can even
strong
library. Look for the lectures for Dr. Sanford Lowe, and you'll get it all.
If not all, you get quite a bit. Because we don't have it all. Just
Yeah, I think that the reasons for a lot of anti-Semitism goes back to the fear of something different. That when you look at Jews, here you have people that celebrate their Sabbath on Saturday instead of Sunday. Here you have people that when they're in their synagogue on, they have their tefillin on, they have their sideburns. They walk down the street, they look extremely different. And I think it's the fear of a lot of people of something different. Much like people are bigoted against black people, it's something different, and that's something to be afraid of.
Well, I think that perhaps adds to the momentum, to be sure, but I think one of the major reasons is precisely that is the basis of anti-Semitism we discussed just a moment ago, is that they did not recognize as the coming Redeemer. And that could not be forgiven to those people who converted, Jews, the first Jews who converted, actually. First, Christians were Jews, you know.
Seems that most of Christianity has forgotten that he was a Jew.
But that's, I'm glad you mentioned that, because some people don't even know that Jesus Christ was a Jew, maybe.
The model for many of the Germans and the SS was he hated the Romans, then he welcomed the Jews, but when the Jews would not convert, he started hating the Jews, and he said and wrote, Martin Luther, you know, like the Lutheran Church is based on that. He said, why don't you take the Jews, put them in the synagogue, and burn them down? And that is your model for the gas chamber. That is where the idea originated, were reinforced.
Professor Brown shakes his head. I don't think he agrees with you. I'm not sure that I do. In that case, it's a little bit too far-fetched. But are there any other questions which, you know, we can't answer it all, but we just try to? Yeah.
I think it was interesting towards the end of the movie that Edward Woodward said that if we trivialize history, we're bound to repeat the same mistakes.
That's right.
And right now,
minority on this planet. I belong to one such group. And just the fact that we do well at many things upsets people. The fact that the Chinese, everybody else, they're doing so well at UC Berkeley these days. It upsets people. These kids come in there and work so hard and study so hard, find themselves in large numbers there. It upsets people.
And are successful. Well, particularly, why don't you have the last word? You like it. And you are a minority too for practical purposes.
I think the one focus that Hitler had specifically against the Jews was the charge of Judeo-Bolshevism. That you have, I think someone alluded to it in a speech, Dr. Brown, I believe, but I think that is also a component that should be highlighted, because that is neither, it was neither ancient or modern anti-Semitism. It was something that was so Jewry with socialism.
Well, that and particularly Bolshevism.
And Bolshevism in particular.
Yeah.
Because so many of the progenitors of revolutionary socialism and their acolytes within the Western democracies happened to be Jewish, that brought out a lot of animosity directed towards these people who were viewed as full.
Well, particularly since the Bolsheviks embraced, or Lenin embraced Marx and Engels, Jewish. So that, you know, that was a charge. But Lenin and Stalin and all the other ones, with few exceptions to the rule, were not Jewish. There are quite a few there, but the majority was certainly everything else but Jewish.
Just as kind of an anecdote to close up, that I once came across a document. It was a handout. It was from a 1930s demonstration. The object of the handout was AIDS. The sense of the document was that Einstein shouldn't come in part because he was Jewish, but the major grievance was he was a socialist. They didn't, this was 1930, in the 1930s. And they didn't want Einstein to come in primarily because of his political beliefs, which were considered to be antithetic to American capitalism. So that Einstein, I mean, you could charge that it was in part anti-Semitism, but I think that the overwhelming opposition